On the night of September 14th, 1984, 11 people were eliminated across two moonshine operations in Breathitt County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Jackson Hollow Massacre. All adults, all members of the Caldwell family's distilling network. The method was merciless. Hunting rifles fired from darkness, shotguns at close range, and a warehouse set ablaze to erase evidence that couldn't be hidden. The perpetrators weren't federal agents conducting a raid or drug cartels expanding territory. They were three members of the Harlow family, a father and his two sons, moving through the September night like ghosts who knew every trail, every creek crossing, every hiding spot in these mountains because they'd walked them for 4 generations. The FBI would later call it one of the most premeditated acts of revenge in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't about territory disputes, wasn't about unpaid debts, wasn't even about generations of family hatred. It was about a moonshine recipe written on yellowed paper in 1891, worth an estimated $500,000 in annual production value, stolen on a Tuesday afternoon in August, and one man's absolute certainty that theft of his family's legacy demanded blood payment according to codes older than any government that tried to regulate these mountains. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Breathitt County, sprawled across 495 square miles of central Kentucky in 1984, wedged between the Daniel Boone National Forest and the coal fields that had once made eastern Kentucky prosperous, but now lay dying. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ridges covered with oak, hickory, and pine, rising over 2,000 feet, their valleys so narrow that entire communities existed in hollows where the sun only reached for 3 hours each day. Population stood around 16,000, most concentrated in Jackson, the county seat, with the rest scattered across hollers with names like Troublesome Creek, War Fork, and Lost Creek, communities so isolated they might as well have been separate nations. September in central Kentucky meant temperatures still climbing into the mid-80s during the day, humidity so thick you could wring water from the air, dropping to the low 60s at night when fog rolled down from the ridges and turned the world into something from a ghost story. The air smelled like tobacco curing in barns, wood smoke from cooking fires, wild muscadine growing along creek banks, and underneath it all, the sweet fermentation smell of corn mash that anyone who knew moonshine could identify from 100 yards away. At night, you could hear the entire hollow settling, crickets and tree frogs screaming in the humidity, distant dogs barking at shadows, the occasional rumble of coal trucks on Route 15, hauling loads that got smaller every year as mines shut down one after another. But 1984 was a catastrophic year for eastern Kentucky. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains for nearly a century was in freefall, crushed by mechanization that eliminated thousands of jobs overnight, environmental regulations that shut down marginal operations, and Western strip-mined coal that undercut Appalachian deep-mined prices by 50%. Mines that had employed entire communities now sat abandoned, their portals sealed with concrete, their equipment rusting in the rain, their company towns slowly dying as families moved away, seeking work that no longer existed. In Breathitt County, unemployment officially hit 28%, but everyone knew the real number was closer to 45% when you counted people who'd given up looking for jobs that weren't there. Men who'd spent their lives underground, breathing coal dust that would eventually kill them, destroying their bodies for union wages that once meant something, now had nothing. Disability checks that barely covered rent, food stamps that bought humiliation at the grocery store, and a growing understanding that the world had moved on and left them behind to die slowly in hollows nobody remembered. In that economic wasteland, moonshine wasn't just a business. It was survival. The last viable industry left for people with more pride than options, more knowledge than education, more determination than future. The culture of illegal distilling ran deeper than law, deeper than morality, into the bedrock of Kentucky identity itself. Making shine was what mountain people had done for 2 centuries, ever since their Scots-Irish ancestors brought the knowledge across the Atlantic and discovered that these mountains had everything needed for perfect whiskey. Clear spring water that ran cold even in September, corn that grew in creek bottomland, isolation that kept federal agents at bay most of the time, and a network of customers who preferred untaxed liquor to the legal kind that cost twice as much and tasted worse. By 1984, with coal dying and tobacco following close behind under government pressure and health concerns, moonshine represented the last way for families to make real money without leaving the mountains that had been home for 8 generations. The risk was federal prison, 5 to 10 years, if you got caught with a still. But most people figured that was better than watching your children go hungry, while politicians in Frankfurt talked about economic development programs that never materialized. The Harlow family had been making moonshine since 1891, when Raymond Harlow's great-grandfather developed a recipe that became legendary across 3 states. Raymond Dale Harlow was 59 years old that September, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6'2", lean and sinewy with the kind of wiriness that came from a lifetime of physical labor, combined with the stress that burned calories faster than food could replace them. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old saddle leather, with eyes so dark brown they looked black in certain light. A thick mustache, completely gray now, drooped past his jawline. His hands were huge, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made every movement painful. Fingers permanently stained from handling copper and corn mash and 1,000 other substances that had soaked into his skin over 5 decades. A scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from 1967 when a still exploded and sent shrapnel through his face, costing him the vision in that eye and leaving tissue that looked like melted candle wax. Every morning, Raymond woke at 3:30 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1923, made coffee in a percolator so old the interior was stained black, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk during those early hours, never had. Just sat in darkness that his one good eye had learned to navigate, drank coffee strong enough to strip rust, and thought about the business of staying alive in a world that had stopped valuing men like him sometime around 1975. He'd married Carol Jean Combs in 1948, right after coming home from occupied Japan, where he'd served with the 11th Airborne Division, seen things that still woke him up at 3:30 a.m., whether he wanted to wake up or not. They'd had 2 sons. Michael was 35 now, built like his father with the same quiet intensity and obsessive attention to detail. Dennis was 32, bigger than Michael, stronger, with a temper that required careful management and a mean streak that worried Raymond because he recognized it from his own younger years. Carol was 58, a thin woman whose face showed every hard year, hands as rough as Raymond's from decades of keeping a household running on money that barely existed and often didn't exist at all. What Raymond valued most wasn't the money from moonshine, though God knew they needed every penny with 2 adult sons trying to establish their own households in an economy that offered nothing. What he valued was legacy, the knowledge that the Harlow name meant something in Breathitt County, meant quality, honesty in a dishonest business, and a product that 4 generations had perfected through trial and error, and accumulated knowledge that you couldn't learn from books or schools. His great-grandfather Ezekiel Harlow had developed their recipe in 1891, during the years when making liquor was both legal and respectable, before Prohibition transformed distillers into criminals and drove the industry underground. That recipe, written in Ezekiel's hand on paper now so fragile Raymond kept it in a locked box, was the only inheritance Raymond had to give his sons in a world where men like them owned nothing else of value. The secret wasn't just in the corn ratio, though Ezekiel had perfected that through years of experimentation. It wasn't just the fermentation time, though that mattered critically. The real secret was the addition of sorghum molasses at a specific temperature for a specific duration during distillation, creating a flavor profile impossible to replicate without knowing the exact method. Michael Ray Harlow was 35 years old that summer, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He stood 5'11", broad through the shoulders from years of manual labor, with arms corded with muscle built from hauling 50-pound bags of sugar and wrestling 300-pound copper stills into position on mountain slopes, so steep you needed ropes to stay upright. His face was angular like his father's, with the same dark eyes that seemed to see through whatever you were saying to the truth underneath. He kept his brown hair cut military short, his beard trimmed neat, and moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that one mistake in the moonshine business could mean prison or death or both. Every morning, Michael woke at 4:30 in the small house he'd built on his father's property, made breakfast for his wife Linda and their 2 daughters, then drove to whatever site they were running shine that week. Locations changed constantly, never more than 2 runs from the same spot before moving on, a security measure that had kept the Harlow operation free from federal interference for 93 years. Michael was methodical, patient, the kind of man who thought 5 steps ahead and rarely made mistakes because his father had taught him that moonshining required intelligence as much as skill, that the families who survived were the ones who planned carefully and never got greedy enough to draw attention. Dennis Wayne Harlow was 32, same height as Michael, but built thicker, stockier, with a barrel chest and shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from oak. He had the Harlow features, the angular face, the intense eyes. But where Michael was calm and calculating, Dennis was volatile, quicker to anger, slower to forgive perceived insults or disrespect. A scar bisected his right eyebrow, a souvenir from a bar fight in Jackson when he was 24, a reminder that Dennis's temper had cost him before and would probably cost him again. He'd never married, lived in a trailer on the Harlow property, spent his evenings drinking Budweiser and cleaning his hunting rifles with obsessive care that bordered on ritualistic, talking to himself in low tones that worried Michael because he'd heard their father do the same thing in the years after Japan. Dennis was dangerous, Michael knew. Had always been dangerous, the kind of man who needed violence the way other men needed food or water, who'd spent his whole life looking for permission to unleash something dark that lived inside him. Raymond had always known how to channel that darkness, how to point it in useful directions, how to keep Dennis controlled. But Michael worried what would happen if that control ever slipped, if Dennis ever got permission to become what he'd always wanted to be. The Harlow recipe was their inheritance, their identity, the only thing of value they possessed in a world where men like them were considered disposable by everyone who mattered. Raymond had taught both sons every aspect of the operation from the time they were old enough to haul water, passing down knowledge that represented 93 years of accumulated expertise. The recipe itself, the exact proportions and timing, Raymond had shown them only 5 years ago, in 1979, when he'd turned 54 and started thinking about mortality and legacy and what happened to family secrets when the keepers of those secrets died. He'd made both sons memorize it, made them practice it under his supervision until they could produce perfect shine blindfolded, made them swear on their mother's life that they'd never write it down, never share it with anyone outside the immediate family, never let the knowledge leave the Harlow bloodline. That recipe was supposed to employ Harlow men for another 3 generations, supposed to feed grandchildren, not yet born, supposed to be the foundation on which the family built whatever future was possible in these dying mountains. The Harlow recipe produced shine, unlike anything else in eastern Kentucky. Other moonshiners made adequate product, clear corn liquor that burned going down and gave you a headache if you drank too much, sold for $30 per gallon to distributors who watered it down and resold it in cities. The Harlow product was different, smooth as aged bourbon, with a subtle sweetness from the sorghum molasses that Ezekiel had discovered by accident in 1891, strong at 140 proof, but didn't burn, left you clear-headed the next morning instead of hungover. People who knew whiskey could taste the difference immediately. Distributors in Louisville and Cincinnati paid $60 per gallon for Harlow Shine, double the standard rate, and their customers paid premium prices because quality mattered more than price to people who could afford both. At full production, running 2 300-gallon stills twice weekly, the Harlow operation produced approximately 80 gallons per week, $4,800 in revenue, over $240,000 annually. In Breathitt County in 1984, where median household income was $11,000, the Harlow family's moonshine business represented wealth that was almost obscene. But that wealth was fragile, dependent entirely on the recipe's secrecy. If competitors learned the method, could replicate the taste, The premium prices would evaporate overnight. The Harlow family would become just another crew making adequate shine for adequate money, their legacy reduced to nothing, their inheritance stolen. On August 15th, 1984, a Thursday afternoon, when temperatures had climbed to 91 degrees and humidity made the air feel like breathing through wet cotton, Raymond discovered that his worst fear had materialized. He'd gone to Jackson to deliver product to his main distributor, a man named Frank Owens, who ran a trucking company that served as cover for moving illegal liquor across 3 states. Frank's warehouse sat on the edge of town, a nondescript metals building that could have housed anything legal. Raymond pulled around back, knocked 3 times, waited for Frank to open the door. The greeting was curt, professional, exactly what Raymond expected. But then Frank led him to the storage area and showed him something that made Raymond's blood run cold. 12 cases of moonshine, 144 mason jars, all labeled with a hand-drawn logo that Raymond didn't recognize. Frank opened a jar, poured 2 glasses, handed one to Raymond. "Try this," Frank said. "Tell me what you taste." Raymond drank, felt the liquid spread across his tongue, and tasted his own recipe. Not similar, not close. Exact. The corn ratio, the fermentation time, the sorghum molasses at precisely the right temperature. Someone had replicated the Harlow method perfectly, was producing shine identical to what Raymond had been making for 40 years, what his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had made before him. "Where'd this come from?" Raymond asked. Voice carefully controlled, but Frank heard the danger underneath. New supplier out of Lost Creek, Caldwell family. Started selling about 3 weeks ago. Products identical to yours, Ray. I'm talking perfect match. And they're selling for $45 per gallon, undercutting your price by 25%. I wanted to give you fair warning before I make any decisions about who to buy from going forward. Raymond set down the glass carefully, afraid he might crush it in his hand if he held it any longer. "Who's running the Caldwell operation?" "Tommy Caldwell," Frank said. "Guy's about 40, been making shine for maybe 10 years. Never produced anything special until last month. Then suddenly he's making product that tastes exactly like Harlow shine." Raymond nodded slowly, understanding clicking into place like a rifle bolt, chambering around. Someone told him. Someone gave him our recipe. Frank looked uncomfortable. "Ray, I don't know nothing about that. I just buy product and move it. Whatever beef you got with Caldwell, that's between you and him. But business is business. If he's selling the same quality for less money, I gotta consider switching suppliers." Raymond walked out of that warehouse into August heat that felt cold compared to the ice forming in his chest. Raymond drove home from Jackson in silence, his 1978 Ford F-150 rattling over county roads that had turned to dust in the August heat. The 25-minute journey felt like hours, his mind cycling through rage, disbelief, and cold calculation about what came next. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd exhausted every legal option. Police wouldn't help protect an illegal recipe used for illegal business. Courts offered no remedy for moonshiners who couldn't admit to federal crimes without incriminating themselves. The law had failed before he'd even considered using it, which was exactly what Raymond had known would happen. Carol met him at the door, saw his face, understood immediately. "Something's wrong," she said. not a question. Raymond walked past her to the kitchen table, sat down heavily, put his face in his hands. Someone stole the recipe. Carol's hand went to her mouth. The Caldwell crew out of Lost Creek. They're making our shine. Exact copy. Selling it cheaper, taking our customers. How? Only 3 people know that recipe. You, Michael, Dennis. And I know none of you told. Raymond looked up at his wife. Someone figured it out. Maybe they got close enough to watch us work, timed our process, reverse engineered it. Or maybe, he paused. Someone in the family talked without meaning to, shared details they thought were harmless. Either way, 93 years of Harlow legacy just got stolen, and we got no legal way to get it back. That evening, Raymond called his sons to the house. They gathered at the kitchen table where Raymond had taught them to read, where they'd shared thousands of meals, where every important Harlow family decision had been made for 6 decades. Michael arrived first, still in his work clothes, sawdust in his hair from his day job at the lumber mill. Dennis came next, already drinking, Budweiser in hand, that wild energy about him that meant trouble. Carol stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. The recipe's been stolen, Raymond said without preamble. Tommy Caldwell's crew is making our shine. Perfect copy. They're undercutting our price, taking our customers. Michael's jaw tightened. How's that possible? Nobody outside this family knows. Somebody found out, Raymond said. Don't matter how. What matters is 93 years of work, 4 generations of knowledge. Just became worthless. We lose our premium prices. We become just another crew making ordinary shine for ordinary money. Everything our family built, gone. Dennis's hands curled into fists on the table. So we go to Caldwell, make him stop. Raymond shook his head. And say what? You stole our illegal recipe for our illegal product? Please stop competing with us. Law won't help moonshiners. We're on our own. Then what? Michael asked quietly. What do we do? Raymond looked at his 2 sons, at the men he'd raised to value family and honor above everything else, who'd learned from childhood that in these mountains you protected what was yours or you lost everything. We give Caldwell one chance to stop production, destroy his equipment, walk away from our recipe. He takes that chance, we let it go. He doesn't, Raymond paused. We handle it mountain style. On August 20th, 6 days after discovering the theft, Raymond drove to Lost Creek and found Tommy Caldwell at his property. It was 3:00 in the afternoon, temperature pushing 89 degrees, humidity so thick that Raymond's shirt was soaked through before he'd walked 20 feet from his truck. Tommy's place was a run-down farmhouse with a collapsing barn behind it, equipment visible through the open doors, copper gleaming in the shadows. Tommy was in the yard, working on a tractor engine, hands black with grease, when Raymond pulled up. He stood, slowly when he saw who'd arrived, grabbed a rag, wiped his hands. Raymond Harlow, Tommy said. What brings you out this way? My recipe, Raymond said, voice flat, controlled. The one you're using to make shine that's identical to what my family's been producing for 93 years. Tommy's face showed carefully practiced innocence. I don't know what you're talking about, Ray. I developed my own recipe through trial and error. Any similarity is coincidence. Don't insult me, Raymond said quietly. I tasted your product. It's not similar. It's exact. Same corn ratio, same fermentation time, same sorghum molasses. Process my great-grandfather developed in 1891. You didn't figure that out through trial and error. Somebody gave you our method, or you stole it somehow. Either way, that's Harlow knowledge you got no right to. Tommy tossed the rag aside, straightened up to his full height. He was 41 years old, 6'2", outweighed Raymond by 60 pounds of muscle built from farm work. Even if I had your recipe, which I'm not saying I do, what exactly you planning to do about it? Sue me? Call the police? We both know you can't do neither without admitting to federal crimes. Raymond stepped closer, using the intensity in his one good eye to compensate for the height and weight disadvantage. I'm giving you fair warning, mountain style. You stop production immediately. You destroy your equipment. You never make another batch using Harlow methods. You do that by September 1st. 12 days from now, we forget this happened. Tommy laughed, but there was an edge to it. Or what? You threaten me on my own property? Old man, I got 3 sons, I got cousins, I got 8 men working my crew. You really want to start something you can't finish? Raymond held his gaze. September 1st. Stop production, or we settle this the old way. He turned, walked back to his truck, drove away without looking back. Behind him, Tommy Caldwell was already calculating odds that were about to turn against him in ways he couldn't imagine. Raymond gathered his sons that night. Same kitchen table, same grim understanding that they were moving past, talking into something darker. I gave him until September 1st, Raymond said. He denied everything, acted like I was threatening him for no reason, said he's got 8 men on his crew, implied we couldn't touch him. September 1st came and went. The Caldwell operation continued running, producing Harlow quality shine, undercutting prices, taking customers. Frank Owens called on September 3rd to say he was switching to Caldwell as his primary supplier. Sorry, Ray, but business is business. That phone call reached Raymond at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. He listened, said nothing, hung up. Then he walked to his gun cabinet and began taking inventory. Michael found him there an hour later, rifles spread across the kitchen table, boxes of ammunition stacked beside them. Dad, Michael said carefully, what are you doing? Raymond looked at his oldest son. Protecting what's ours, the only way left to us. If Caldwell won't stop voluntarily, we make him stop. Permanently. Michael's face went pale. You're talking about killing people. Over moonshine. Over our family's survival, Raymond corrected. Over 93 years of legacy. Over the only inheritance I got to give you and your brother. You think I want this? But we got 2 choices. Let Caldwell destroy everything 4 generations built, or we defend what's ours. The preparation started September 4th and continued for 10 days, methodical and careful. Raymond applying the same precision to planning violence that he'd always applied to moonshining. They met every evening after dark at different locations, rotating between Raymond's barn, Michael's basement, and remote clearings where they could talk without being overheard. Raymond had served in occupied Japan, hadn't seen combat, but had received military training, understood basic tactics and coordination. Michael had been in the National Guard for 6 years in the 1970s, had learned small unit operations and weapons handling. Together, they planned the assault. Because that's what it was, a military operation targeting an illegal business that the law wouldn't protect. Dennis listened, contributed ideas about approaches and escape routes, absorbed strategy, transformed gradually from moonshiner into something else. The arsenal assembled piece by piece. Raymond's Remington 870 shotgun, 12 gauge, bought new in 1965 and maintained with religious care. Michael's Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifle in 36, a gift from Raymond on his 21st birthday. Dennis's Marlin 336 lever action in 30-30, purchased from a pawn shop in Jackson. Raymond also retrieved his father's Springfield 1903 rifle from World War I, still functional after 66 years, and a .38 special revolver that Dennis kept for close work. 5 firearms for 3 men, more than enough for what they intended. They purchased ammunition carefully, spreading purchases across 5 different stores in 3 counties, never buying more than 2 boxes at any location. Paying cash, avoiding patterns that might raise suspicion. 4 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, 3 boxes of 30-06, 3 boxes of 30-30, 2 boxes of 38 special, 1 box of 30-06 for the Springfield. Raymond kept receipts in a coffee can under his kitchen sink, some part of him still believing in documentation, in proving they'd acted within bounds of legality right up until the moment they crossed into something else. Dennis bought 5-gallon gasoline cans from a hardware store in Hazard, said he needed them for farm equipment. Michael acquired rope and duct tape from Walmart, standard supplies that could have innocent explanations. Raymond purchased county maps from the Forest Service, spread them across his kitchen table, marked the Caldwell property location, marked approach routes from 3 directions, marked the warehouse where Caldwell stored finished product, measured distances and calculated timing with precision that came from decades of planning, illegal operations that required military-level coordination to avoid federal detection. They didn't discuss what they were planning in explicit terms, never said kill or murder or massacre. Instead, they talked about handling the Caldwell problem, about protecting family legacy, about making sure everyone in Breathitt County understood that stealing from the Harlow family had consequences. This linguistic evasion allowed them to maintain psychological distance from what they were becoming, to frame it as necessary business action, rather than premeditated slaughter of 11 human beings. On September 13th, they gathered one final time at Raymond's house. Carol had gone to stay with her sister in Lexington, said she couldn't be present for what was coming, couldn't watch her husband and sons transform into something that terrified her. Raymond laid out the plan one last time. They would hit the Caldwell operation after midnight when most of the crew would be sleeping in the bunkhouse behind the main distillery. They would disable vehicles first, preventing escape. Then they would move through the property systematically, neutralizing threats before anyone could organize resistance or flee to get help. Anyone who surrenders, we let them live, Raymond said. This is about Caldwell and his family, not about massacring workers who don't even know they're using stolen methods. Dennis disagreed immediately. Anyone who surrenders becomes a witness, Dad. We can't leave witnesses to testify. Michael and Raymond looked at each other. Finally, Raymond nodded. No witnesses. The temperature had dropped to 64 degrees by the time the Harlow men gathered at the base of Lost Creek Ridge, but the humidity remained oppressive, the air thick with moisture that made breathing difficult. No moon tonight, just stars brilliant and cold above the black silhouettes of mountains. Raymond drove his F-150, Michael following in his Chevy S-10, Dennis riding with their father. They parked on an abandoned logging road 2 miles from the Caldwell property, pulled off into tree cover where the vehicles wouldn't be visible from the county road. The truck's engines ticked as they cooled, metal contracting in the humid darkness. Raymond stood outside his vehicle, Remington 870 heavy in his hands, waiting for his breathing to steady. It didn't. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system, his one good eye seeing shapes in the darkness that weren't there. He'd expected the same cold determination he'd felt at 19 when preparing for potential combat in occupied Japan. Instead, he felt something closer to terror, understanding that in the next few hours, he was about to become something he could never unbecome. Cross a line that would define the rest of his life and destroy his family, regardless of whether they succeeded or got caught. Michael checked his Winchester Model 70 for the 4th time, confirming the bolt action worked smoothly. The magazine was loaded with 5 rounds of .30-06. His face showed nothing, carefully blank, but Raymond could see his oldest son's hands trembling slightly. Michael had never killed anyone, had spent his National Guard years during peacetime doing training exercises and weekend drills, never expected to use his military knowledge for anything like this. Dennis had wild energy about him, pacing in tight circles, breathing too fast, hands opening and closing around his Marlin 3 and .36. This was what Dennis had been waiting for his entire life, Raymond thought, with something close to grief. Permission to become what he'd always wanted to be. What Raymond had spent 32 years trying to prevent. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "last chance to call this off. We go through with this, 11 people probably die. Maybe more. We go to prison for life. Mom loses her family. Everything we're trying to protect gets destroyed anyway." Raymond looked at his sons, these men he'd raised, whose lives he was about to ruin. "You're right," he said. "This destroys everything. But letting Caldwell steal our legacy also destroys everything. Either way, the Harlow family as we knew it ends tonight. Only question is whether we go down fighting or we go down accepting theft." Dennis chambered around in his Marlin, the lever action making a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud. "I'm done talking," Dennis said. "Let's finish this." They moved through the forest without speaking, using hand signals Raymond had learned in basic training 36 years ago, covering the 2 miles in 40 minutes, moving slowly to avoid making noise that would alert anyone at the Caldwell property. The temperature continued dropping, Raymond's breath making small clouds in the darkness, sweat cold on his back, despite the humidity. At 11:38 p.m., they reached the ridge, overlooking the Caldwell operation. Through the trees, maybe 400 yards distant, they could see the main barn where the stills operated, a bunkhouse behind it, a warehouse structure to the east, 4 pickup trucks parked in the yard, a single security light casting long shadows. Smoke rose from the barn's chimney despite the September heat, the stills inside running, producing shine made with Harlow methods, taking Harlow customers, destroying 93 years of legacy. Raymond raised his binoculars, counted shapes moving behind barn windows. At least 3 men visible, probably more out of sight. The bunkhouse showed lights in 2 windows, flickering blue glow that meant television. Tommy Caldwell's house sat separate from the operation, maybe 300 yards north, showing lights in multiple windows. Raymond lowered the binoculars, looked at his sons. "Last chance," he said. "We can still walk away." Dennis shook his head. "No, we can't. We're already past the point where walking away means anything." He was right. They were. They approached from the south, using the tree line for cover, staying in shadows beyond the reach of the security light. The barn sat isolated, no neighbors within a mile. The nearest house belonging to Tommy Caldwell's cousin, who knew better than to hear anything that happened at illegal operations. Raymond could smell the mash from 200 yards away, that distinctive sweet fermentation smell that meant corn and sugar and yeast transforming into something worth $60 per gallon, or it had been worth that much before Caldwell started undercutting prices. The barn door stood partially open, light spilling out, voices audible inside, men working the late shift, monitoring temperature, collecting product that would be jarred and distributed by morning. Raymond signaled his sons to positions they'd rehearsed. Michael circled east toward the vehicles, Winchester ready. Dennis moved west toward the bunkhouse, Marlin in hand. Raymond approached the barn door slowly, Remington 870 raised, safety off, finger resting on the trigger. This was it. The last possible moment to turn around, to walk away, to choose law over violence. He stepped inside instead. 2 men were working around a 300-gallon copper still that Raymond recognized immediately because it was identical to the design his grandfather had used, the design that made Harlow shine distinctive, the design that Tommy Caldwell had no right to know about. The men turned at the sound of Raymond's boots on concrete, surprise on their faces, not understanding for a crucial 3 seconds what was happening. Raymond recognized one of them, Billy Jacobs, 28 years old, whose father had worked with Raymond's father back in the 1960s. The other man was younger, maybe 22, unfamiliar. Billy's hands were full of mason jars. The younger man was adjusting the gas burner under the still, controlling temperature with the precision that the Harlow method required. "Where's Tommy?" Raymond asked. Voice flat, empty. Billy set down the jars carefully, hands raised. "Mr. Harlow? What the hell? Tommy ain't here. Gone to Lexington for the weekend. Sir, we don't want no trouble." "You're already in trouble," Raymond said. "You're running my family's recipe, using methods you got no right to know." "We didn't know it was stolen," Billy said quickly. "Tommy told us he developed this himself. Told us it was his own innovation." "We're just workers, Mr. Harlow. Just trying to make money in a county with no jobs." Raymond's finger moved to the trigger. "Should have asked more questions about where your boss learned his methods." The Remington roared in the enclosed space, impossibly loud, muzzle flash, brilliant in the dim barn. Billy Jacobs took the blast center mass, flew backward into the wall, slid down leaving a red smear. The younger man tried to run for the back door, got maybe 3 steps. Raymond pumped the shotgun, chambered another shell, fired. The man fell face first into bags of sugar stacked against the far wall. Dennis appeared in the doorway behind Raymond, marlin raised, face showing something that might have been excitement or might have been horror or might have been both. Dad, two more coming from the bunkhouse, heard the shots. Raymond reloaded the Remington with practiced efficiency, 3 shells loaded in maybe 5 seconds, muscle memory from 50 years of hunting. The barn had 2 doors, front and back. Dennis covered the back. Raymond moved to the front, positioned himself beside the opening, waited. He could hear running footsteps, voices calling out, asking what happened, what's wrong, confusion and fear. 2 figures burst through the front door, moving fast, not thinking, responding to crisis on instinct. Raymond fired twice, both barrels discharging within 2 seconds. Both men fell in the doorway, bodies blocking the entrance. One was still moving, trying to crawl forward, making sounds that weren't quite words. Raymond walked over, looked down at a man, maybe 35 years old, wedding ring on his finger, face twisted in pain and confusion. "Why?" the man gasped. "We didn't do nothing to you." "You worked for Caldwell," Raymond said. "That's enough." He fired the final shell from close range. The man stopped moving. Raymond stood there, shotgun empty, looking at 4 bodies, waiting for guilt or horror or anything human. Felt only cold satisfaction that the first 4 were down. Only 7 left to go. Michael Wilson had positioned himself by the vehicles when the first shotgun blasts echoed from the barn. His assignment was simple: disable the trucks, prevent escape, watch for runners. He'd already shot out the front tires on all 4 pickups, methodical, professional, using his Winchester to punch holes through rubber and metal. But when men started pouring out of the bunkhouse, panicked and confused, military training gave way to something darker. 3 men ran toward the trucks, probably thinking they could still drive on flat tires, desperate enough to try anything. Michael raised his Winchester, aimed at the lead runner, hesitated. These weren't enemy combatants. These were workers, probably just laborers who needed money, who had families, who'd done nothing except take jobs they'd been offered. Then he thought about the Harlow recipe being stolen, about 93 years of legacy being destroyed, about his father's orders. He fired. The lead runner dropped. The other 2 scattered, one diving behind a woodpile, the other sprinting for the tree line. Michael fired again, missed, chambered another round, fired. The second man fell. The third made it to the trees, disappeared into darkness. Michael lowered his rifle, looked at 2 bodies lying in the yard, felt his hands start shaking with delayed recognition of what he'd just done. Dennis had moved to the bunkhouse when the shooting started, kicked the door open with his boot. Marlin 336 leveled. Inside, 4 men were scrambling for weapons that weren't there, trying to organize defense against attackers they hadn't seen. Dennis fired into the enclosed space. Lever, action working smoothly, brass casings ejecting and spinning through the air. 1 man went down immediately. The others dove for cover behind bunk beds that offered psychological protection, but no actual barrier against 30-30 rounds. Dennis advanced into the bunkhouse, firing methodically, moving from target to target with efficiency that suggested he'd been planning this moment his entire life. A man tried to surrender, hands raised, screaming that he gave up. "Please stop." Dennis shot him anyway. Another tried to escape through a window, got halfway through before Dennis's rifle spoke. The man hung there, half in, half out, not moving. The fourth man had wedged himself into a corner, covering his head with his arms, like that would stop bullets, crying, begging, praying. Dennis stood over him, looked down at this complete stranger whose only crime was working for Tommy Caldwell, raised the marlin. The man looked up, met Dennis's eyes, saw nothing there that resembled mercy or humanity. Dennis pulled the trigger. Raymond emerged from the barn, reloading his Remington, looking for his sons. Found Michael standing by the trucks, staring at the bodies he'd created, face pale in the security light. Found Dennis walking out of the bunkhouse, rifle smoking, expression blank. "How many?" Raymond asked. Dennis shrugged. 4 in the bunkhouse, all dead. Michael's voice was barely a whisper. 2 here. 1 got away into the woods. Raymond did the math. 4 in the barn, 4 in the bunkhouse, 2 by the trucks. 10 dead, 1 runner. Tommy Caldwell still unaccounted for. "The warehouse," Raymond said. "Tommy stores finished product there. Probably has someone watching it overnight." They moved toward the warehouse structure, a metal building 100 feet from the main barn. The door was closed, no lights visible. But Raymond could hear movement inside, someone trying to be quiet, trying to hide. He approached the door, tried the handle, locked from inside. Raymond stepped back, aimed the Remington at the lock, fired. The lock exploded. He kicked the door open, stepped inside. Darkness except for moonlight coming through high windows. Raymond's one good eye struggled to adjust, seeing shapes but not details. Then muzzle flash from the far corner, the crack of a rifle, a bullet whining past Raymond's head close enough that he felt the air displacement. Raymond dove behind a stack of pallets, chambered another shell. Someone in here had a weapon, was shooting back, changing the dynamic from massacre to firefight. Dennis and Michael took positions on either side of the door, providing covering fire, while Raymond assessed the situation. The shooter was maybe 50 feet away, behind barrels, had elevation advantage. Raymond couldn't see clearly enough with one eye to make a good shot in darkness. "Michael," Raymond called out, "can you see him?" Michael peered through the doorway, Winchester raised. "Got movement behind the barrels on the left. I can't tell if it's one person or more." Raymond made a decision. Suppressing fire. "Pour rounds into that position. Make them keep their heads down. I'll flank right." The 3 Harlow men opened up, rifles and shotgun firing into the darkness, rounds punching through metal barrels, ricocheting off concrete, filling the warehouse with thunder and cordite smoke. Raymond moved along the right wall using shadows, his Remington ready. Found the shooter crouched behind barrels, reloading, a man maybe 40 years old. Tommy Caldwell himself, defending his operation, his stolen recipe, his life. Tommy saw Raymond tried to bring his rifle up. Too slow. Raymond fired twice. Tommy Caldwell fell backward, rifle clattering to the floor. One man had escaped into the forest, the runner Michael had missed by the trucks. Raymond could hear him crashing through underbrush, heading east toward the county road. probably planning to flag down help or reach a house with a phone. They couldn't let him escape. A witness meant police, FBI, federal prison for life. Raymond whistled twice, the signal for regroup. Michael and Dennis emerged from the warehouse, faces smudged with gunpowder residue, eyes wide. "One got away," Raymond said. "Heading east. We need to find him before he reaches the road." Michael looked sick. "Dad, maybe we let him go. We've killed enough people. If we chase him down, that's not defense anymore. That's hunting a man like an animal." "That's exactly what it is," Dennis said. "And we do it or we spend the rest of our lives in prison." Raymond looked at his oldest son, saw the moral resistance forming, the last thread of conscience that hadn't been burned away by violence. "Michael, I need you to decide right now. You're either with us or you're not. No judgment either way. But I need to know." Michael stood there for a long moment, rifle hanging loose in his hands, looking at his father and brother, at the warehouse behind them where Tommy Caldwell's body lay, at the barn and bunkhouse where 9 other men had died in the last 20 minutes. Then he raised his Winchester. "I'm with you. Let's finish this." They spread out, moving through forest in the direction the runner had gone, tracking by sound more than sight. The moon had risen, providing some illumination through the trees, enough to see shapes and shadows. Raymond's one good eye struggled in the darkness, depth perception gone, seeing everything flat and two-dimensional. He moved carefully, rifle ready, listening for movement. The runner had maybe 5 minutes head start, but panic made people careless, made them noisy. Raymond heard branches breaking to his left, adjusted course, moved that direction, found the runner 200 yards from the warehouse, hiding behind a fallen log, breathing so hard Raymond could hear him from 30 feet away. The man was young, maybe 25, wearing only jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot. Must have been sleeping when the attack started. His feet were bleeding from running through forest in darkness. He saw Raymond approaching, tried to run again, stumbled, fell. Raymond walked up slowly. Remington aimed at the center of mass. The young man held up his hands, voice breaking. "Please, Jesus Christ, please. I got a baby, 2 months old, little girl. My wife's at home waiting for me. Please don't do this." Raymond felt something crack in his chest. A baby, 2 months old. This man had a daughter who'd grow up without a father because Raymond had decided protecting a moonshine recipe mattered more than human life. Dennis appeared from the left, Michael from the right, forming a triangle around the fallen man. "What's your name?" Raymond asked. The man's voice was barely a whisper. "Aaron. Aaron Combs. I'm Carol's second cousin, Mr. Harlow. We're family. Distant, but still family. Don't do this. We're blood." Raymond closed his one good eye, opened it, looked at this young man who was related to his wife, who had a 2-month-old daughter, who was begging for mercy that Raymond wanted desperately to give but couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," Raymond said. And he meant it. Aaron started to say something else, probably another plea, probably invoking his daughter's name, trying to find words that would change what was about to happen. Raymond pulled the trigger before Aaron could finish the sentence. Couldn't listen to any more begging. Couldn't hear about babies who'd grow up without fathers. The shotgun roared once. Aaron Combs fell backward into leaves and didn't move. Dennis and Michael stood silent, watching their father. Watching him become something none of them had imagined possible 4 hours ago. Raymond reloaded the Remington with shaking hands. 11 down, he said, voice hollow, legacy protected, family destroyed. Let's go home. Michael Wilson stood in the forest at 1:47 a.m., Winchester hanging from his hands like it weighed 100 pounds, staring at Aaron Combs's body. The young man's eyes were still open, staring at stars through the tree canopy, face frozen in an expression of hope that had died with him. Michael had killed 2 men tonight by the trucks, had watched his father execute at least 6 more, had witnessed his brother become something inhuman in the bunkhouse. 11 deaths total, and Michael carried responsibility for every one of them, whether he'd pulled the trigger or not. The weight of what they'd done crashed down on him like physical pressure, crushing, suffocating. His hands started shaking violently, rifle slipping from his grip, falling to the ground. He dropped to his knees, gasping for air, trying to breathe through panic that felt like drowning. "Dad," Michael gasped. "What have we done? What the hell have we done?" "We protected our family," Raymond said. But his voice lacked conviction. Even Raymond was starting to understand the magnitude of what they'd become. "We murdered 11 people," Michael said. "Workers who probably didn't even know they were using stolen recipes. Men with families, with children. Aaron had a 2-month-old baby girl who'll never know her father because we decided copper and corn mash mattered more than human life. Dennis stood apart from them, Marlon cradled in his arms, face showing no emotion, no regret, nothing human. This was necessary, Dennis said. They stole from us. Consequences had to be paid. Michael looked at his younger brother. This man who'd killed 4 people in the bunkhouse without hesitation, who seemed unaffected by violence that had broken everyone else. "You're a monster," Michael whispered. "You enjoyed this." Dennis's expression finally changed, something dangerous flickering across his face. "I did what needed doing. Same as you. Same as Dad. Don't pretend you're better than me because you feel bad about it afterwards. Guilt doesn't make you moral. It just makes you weak." Raymond stepped between his sons. "Enough. We're done here. We need to move. The bodies will be found by morning. We need to be home, in bed, with alibis ready." They walked back through the forest to their trucks. 3 men who'd left home as a family and returned as accomplices to mass murder. The drive home was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts, his own horror, his own realization that their lives had ended, even if they were still breathing. When they reached the Harlow property, Raymond told his sons to clean their weapons, burn their clothes, shower thoroughly, go to bed, act normal in the morning when police inevitably came asking questions. Michael went home to his house, to his wife Linda sleeping peacefully, to his 2 daughters in rooms down the hall. Innocent children who didn't know their father had become a killer tonight. He stood in the shower for an hour, scrubbing his skin until it was raw, trying to wash off blood that wasn't visible but felt permanently stained into his pores. When he finally went to bed, Linda stirred, asked sleepily where he'd been. "Just helping Dad with some still maintenance," Michael lied. "Go back to sleep." But Michael didn't sleep. He lay in darkness, seeing Aaron Combs's face, hearing Billy Jacobs's voice, asking what the hell was happening, watching men fall over and over in his mind. At 4:30 a.m., he went to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. Dennis went to his trailer, opened a beer, sat on his porch, smoking cigarettes and watching the sun come up. He felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, no humanity. Just satisfaction that the problem had been solved, that the Harlow family had defended its legacy. If that made him a monster like Michael said, Dennis could live with that. Monsters survived when good men died. Raymond sat at his kitchen table in darkness, Carol still at her sister's, the house empty and silent. His Remington 870 lay on the table, barrel still warm, stinking of gunpowder and death. He'd killed 6 men tonight, maybe 7, had ordered his sons to kill the rest. 93 years of Harlow legacy had been protected, and the cost was everything. The first 911 call came at 6:53 a.m. from a propane delivery driver who'd arrived at the Caldwell property to refill tanks and found bodies scattered across the yard. His voice on the recording was high and panicked, barely coherent, repeating over and over that everyone was dead. Everyone was dead. Send help. The second call came at 7:18 a.m. from Tommy Caldwell's wife, Rebecca, who'd woken up alone, drove to the operation, looking for her husband, found the warehouse door blown open, and Tommy's body inside. Her screams could be heard in the background of the 911 call, animal sounds of grief that the dispatcher would remember for the rest of her life. By 8 a.m., the Breathitt County Sheriff's Department, Kentucky State Police, and volunteer fire departments from 3 counties had descended on what remained of the Caldwell operation. What they found exceeded every nightmare scenario law enforcement in central Kentucky had ever confronted. Sheriff James Mitchell was 48 years old, had worn the badge for 19 years in Breathitt County, thought he'd seen every variation of violence these mountains produced. He'd investigated domestic murders, bar fights that turned deadly, overdoses from pills that were destroying Appalachia faster than coal collapse. But standing in the center of that property, looking at 11 bodies scattered across 3 structures, he felt his understanding of human nature fundamentally shift. The bodies were everywhere. 4 in the barn, all shot at close range with a shotgun. Billy Jacobs and 3 others who'd been working the stills. 4 in the bunkhouse, rifle wounds, defensive positions suggesting they'd tried to fight back or hide. 2 by the trucks, shot while running. Tommy Caldwell in the warehouse, multiple shotgun wounds. The forensic evidence suggested coordinated assault by multiple shooters, military precision, no chaos or panic on the attacker's part. This was systematic elimination, not a fight that escalated. Kentucky State Police Captain David Barnes arrived at 9:15 a.m., called in from Frankfort the moment the body count exceeded 5. Barnes was 52 years old, 27 years with the state police, had investigated everything from drug trafficking to domestic terrorism, He walked the perimeter slowly, studying shell casings, blood patterns, trajectories. Shotgun shells here, rifle brass there, different calibers, at least 3 shooters. Victims caught without weapons, except for Tommy Caldwell, who'd tried to defend himself. This was an ambush. Military-style assault. They never had a chance. Sheriff Mitchell nodded, looking older than his 48 years. We found one body in the forest. Aaron Combs, 25 years old, shot in the back while running away. They hunted him down like an animal. Barnes felt cold certainty settle in his gut. What's the motive? This much planning, this much violence has to be about more than random rivalry. Mitchell pulled out a notebook. Tommy Caldwell started producing high-quality moonshine about 3 weeks ago. Premium stuff, selling stuff for top dollar. Word around the county was it tasted exactly like Harlow shine. Raymond Harlow's family has been making the best moonshine in eastern Kentucky for 90 years. Their recipe is legendary, worth a fortune. Barnes studied the barn, the warehouse, the bodies being photographed and tagged by forensic teams. So Caldwell stole the Harlow recipe somehow, started undercutting their prices, and Raymond Harlow decided that warranted killing 11 people? Mitchell's radio crackled. Sheriff, we got FBI inbound from Louisville. They're taking over. Barnes looked at the mountains surrounding the property, dark and ancient and secretive. These mountains had their own codes, their own justice systems that predated any government. The Harlows were guilty, would be arrested, would face federal prosecution. But Barnes suspected that in some hollers, some people would see them as defenders of family honor rather than mass murderers. The question was whether a jury in Frankfort would make that distinction, or whether the bodies would speak louder than any cultural justification defense attorneys could construct. By noon on September 15th, FBI Special Agent Patricia Coleman had established a command center in the Jackson courthouse. Coleman was 41 years old, 14 years with the Bureau, specialized in organized crime and rural violence. She'd been called in from the Louisville field office the moment the death toll reached double digits. Federal jurisdiction clear, given the scale of carnage and interstate commerce implications of the moonshine trade. As she reviewed crime scene reports and witness statements, Coleman realized this wasn't random gang violence or organized crime expansion. This was old-fashioned blood feud, mountain justice turned into massacre, family defending legacy according to codes that most Americans didn't even know existed anymore. The evidence against Raymond Harlow and his sons was circumstantial but compelling. Shell casings recovered from 3 crime scenes matched common hunting weapons. Witnesses reported Raymond had confronted Tommy Caldwell in late August, made threats about stolen recipes. The motive was clear, documented by multiple sources. But Coleman needed physical evidence, needed the weapons, needed something concrete that would survive defense attorneys arguing about reasonable doubt and circumstantial cases. On September 16th, she obtained federal search warrants for the Harlow property and executed them with overwhelming force. 25 agents, state police backup, tactical team in full gear, expecting resistance, possibly a standoff with men who'd just killed 11 people. What they found was Raymond Harlow sitting on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible on his knees. Michael stood beside him, also unarmed, face pale, but resigned. Dennis was inside the house, made no attempt to resist when agents entered, just stood with his hands raised, expression blank. No drama, no shootout, no final stand. Just three men who'd crossed the darkest line and were ready to face consequences. "Mr. Harlow," Coleman said, approaching with her sidearm drawn, but not aimed. "I'm Special Agent Coleman with the FBI. I have warrants for your arrest in connection with 11 murders at the Caldwell property." Raymond stood slowly, moving like an old man, though he was only 59. "We're not going to make this difficult," Raymond said. "We did what we had to do. Now we'll answer for it." Coleman read him his rights while other agents searched the property. They found the rifles and shotgun in Raymond's gun cabinet, 3 of them still smelling of gunpowder, 1 with blood spatter on the stock. Found ammunition boxes matching casings from the crime scene. Found boots with mud matching soil samples from Caldwell's property. Found gasoline cans, rope, duct tape, county maps with the Caldwell property circled in red marker. The evidence was overwhelming, almost too overwhelming, suggesting the Harlows hadn't tried to hide what they'd done or hadn't believed they'd done anything wrong that required hiding. As agents loaded the 3 men into separate vehicles, Carol Harlow stood on the porch watching. She'd returned from her sister's that morning, learned what had happened, collapsed in grief and horror. Now she stood silent, tears running down her face, watching her husband and sons being taken away, knowing she'd probably never see them as free men again. "Mrs. Harlow," Coleman said gently, "is there anything you want to say?" Carol looked at her husband being put into a federal vehicle, hands cuffed behind his back, at her sons facing life in prison, at a family destroyed by decisions made over moonshine recipes and stolen pride. "He did what he thought mountain men do," Carol said quietly. "Protect what's theirs, defend family honor, settle scores without waiting for law that never helps people like us. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable if you're from these mountains, if you understand the codes we live by." Coleman had no response to that. She'd grown up in Louisville, understood urban poverty and crime, but she'd never lived the specific pressures of Appalachian culture, where honor and legacy mattered more than law or life. The Harlows were guilty, would be convicted, would die in prison. But Coleman suspected that in Breathitt County, some people would always see them as tragic figures rather than monsters. The trial of Raymond Harlow and his 2 sons began in April 1985 in a federal courthouse in Frankfort, Kentucky. The venue had been moved from Breathitt County after defense attorneys successfully argued that finding an impartial jury was impossible in a community where everyone knew both families, where moonshine culture ran so deep that some jurors might sympathize with the defendant's actions, regardless of legality. 33 combined charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, arson, weapons violations, and operating an illegal distillery. So prosecution had forensic evidence linking the Harlow's weapons to bullets recovered from victims' bodies. They had witness testimony about Raymond's confrontation with Tommy Caldwell, about threats made, about deadlines given. They had financial motive. The stolen moonshine recipe worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Most damning, they had the Harlow's own partial admissions, Raymond telling Agent Coleman they'd done what they had to do, Michael telling investigators he'd fired his rifle at the Caldwell property. Dennis refusing to speak, but his silence implying guilt. The evidence was so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from opening statements. The defense, 3 federal public defenders who looked exhausted before jury selection finished, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by theft of irreplaceable family legacy and economic desperation that made the moonshine recipe essential to survival. They brought in historians who explained Appalachian honor culture, the tradition of family recipes passed down for generations, the ways that isolated communities developed their own justice systems when government protection was unavailable or inadequate. They brought in economists who testified about Breathitt County's economic collapse, about 45% unemployment, about families with no legal means of survival, watching their only asset being stolen. They brought in veterans who spoke about Raymond's military service, about how trauma combined with economic stress could create situations where violence seemed like the only option. The prosecution destroyed these arguments systematically. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Wagner was 44 years old, had prosecuted organized crime cases across Kentucky for 15 years, specialized in dismantling cultural justifications violent men use to excuse their actions. Emotional disturbance doesn't involve 10 days of planning, Wagner told the jury during closing arguments. Doesn't involve purchasing ammunition from 5 different stores to avoid suspicion. Doesn't involve drawing maps, coordinating positions, systematically hunting down 11 men, including one who was running away unarmed. Cultural tradition doesn't excuse the execution of workers who didn't even know they were using stolen methods. PTSD doesn't turn moonshiners into executioners who shoot surrendering men. These defendants hunted down human beings like animals, showed no mercy to people begging for their lives, killed a man who was related to Raymond Harlow's own wife. The only appropriate verdict is guilty on all counts. The jury, 12 people from Frankfort and surrounding areas who understood rural poverty but hadn't lived Breathitt County's specific desperation, deliberated for 16 hours over 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty, all charges, all 3 defendants. Sentencing came 5 weeks later. Federal Judge Margaret Harrison, 59 years old, 17 years on the bench, looked at Raymond Harlow, at Michael and Dennis, at men who showed varying degrees of remorse, but all maintained they'd done what mountain codes demanded. Your actions represent a complete rejection of the rule of law, Judge Harrison said. 11 men are dead because you valued a moonshine recipe more than human life. You planned and executed a massacre with military precision, showed no mercy, hunted down a fleeing man and shot him in the back. You've destroyed 2 families, your own and the Caldwells. Raymond Harlow, life without possibility of parole. Michael Harlow, life without parole. Dennis Harlow, life without parole. The courtroom was silent as sentences were read. Raymond showed no reaction, just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he pulled that first trigger that this was exactly where he'd end up. Michael put his face in his hands and wept. Dennis stared straight ahead, expression blank, already gone to some place inside himself where consequences couldn't reach. Raymond Harlow served 40 years in the United States Penitentiary in McCreary, Kentucky, a high-security facility that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. During those decades, he worked in the prison library, teaching other inmates to read, helping them write letters to families they'd destroyed through their own violence. Guards said he was respectful, quiet, never caused trouble, never sought special treatment, carried himself with dignity that seemed inconsistent with his crimes. He read extensively, mostly history and philosophy, trying to find some framework that justified what he'd done, some moral principle that balanced 11 deaths against one stolen recipe. He never found it. Carol visited every Sunday for 32 years, making the 3-hour drive from Breathitt County without fail, even when arthritis made driving painful, even when winter ice made the roads treacherous. They'd sit across from each other in the visiting room, talk about grandchildren Raymond would never meet, about mountains he'd never see again, about a life that had ended on September 14th, 1984. She died of heart failure in 2016, 89 years old, still believing her husband had been more victim than villain, that the system had failed him before he'd failed himself. Raymond wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. On March 22, 2025, at 99 years old, Raymond Dale Harlow died of pneumonia in the prison infirmary, his body finally surrendering after nearly a century of hard use. The chaplain reported that Raymond's last coherent words were about copper stills and corn mash, and mountains he'd never walk again. Whether he felt remorse in those final moments, nobody knows. Michael Harlow remains incarcerated at USP McCreary at age 75. Parole denied in 2000, 2010, and 2020. In a rare 2018 interview with a documentary filmmaker, Michael said only this: "I followed my father into darkness because that's what mountain sons do. I've had 34 years to think about the 11 men we killed. Still see their faces every night. Still hear Aaron Combs begging for his life, talking about his baby daughter. That's my punishment, worse than any prison." His wife Linda divorced him in 1993, remarried, moved to Ohio with their daughters who barely remember their father exists. Michael receives no visitors except his court-appointed attorney during appeals that go nowhere. Dennis Harlow died in prison in 2008, age 56, killed during a fight with another inmate over something trivial, a television channel, or a perceived insult. Prison records show Dennis had been violent throughout his incarceration, accumulating infractions, spending years in solitary confinement, becoming more dangerous and unstable with each passing year. Some men are broken by what they do. Dennis seemed to have been broken long before September 1984, and the massacre just revealed what had always been there waiting for permission to emerge. The Caldwell family scattered after the massacre. Rebecca Caldwell sold the property in 1986, moved to Virginia, never spoke publicly about the night she found her husband's body in the warehouse. The 11 workers who died left behind 19 children, 8 widows, dozens of extended family members whose lives were destroyed by decisions made by men they'd barely known. Aaron Combs' daughter, born 2 months before her father died, is now 41 years old, works as a nurse in Lexington, knows the story but rarely discusses it. The weight of being the daughter of a man hunted down and executed over moonshine recipes is too heavy to carry openly. Billy Jacobs' widow raised their 3 children alone, working double shifts at a textile factory until it closed, then as a gas station cashier until retirement. She died in 2019, 78 years old, still angry at a world that had taken her husband over copper and corn. The Harlow property was abandoned after Carol's death in 2016. The house, built in 1923, collapsed during a storm in 2021. Today it's just a foundation overgrown with kudzu, a scar on the landscape marking where a family's decisions destroyed everything they'd tried to protect. The Caldwell operation site was bulldozed in 1988. Today it's an empty field where nothing grows quite right. The soil too acidic, locals say, but some whisper it's because blood soaked too deep, because violence leaves marks on earth that time can't erase. Breathitt County's population has dropped below 13,000, less than what it was during the coal boom years. The young people leave seeking opportunities elsewhere. The old people stay and remember. 41 years have passed since that September night in the Kentucky mountains. The Caldwell property is overgrown with poison ivy and brambles, the barn foundation barely visible, nature reclaiming ground, where 11 men died over stolen knowledge. Local teenagers claim the area is haunted, that on humid September nights you can still hear gunshots, still smell gunpowder and fear. Parents tell children to stay away. The land itself seems cursed, seems to reject human presence, a permanent monument to what happens when honor and desperation collide in Appalachian darkness. The Harlow recipe, the cause of everything, died with Raymond in 2025. He never passed it to his sons, never wrote it down again after the original paper was seized as evidence in 1984. The knowledge that 4 generations had accumulated, that Ezekiel Harlow had developed in 1891, that was worth an estimated $500,000 annually, ceased to exist. The legacy Raymond killed 11 men to protect was lost anyway, destroyed more completely by his violence than any theft could have accomplished. The recipe's value was always fragile, dependent on secrecy, on trust, on a world where honor meant something and theft demanded blood payment. That world died somewhere between 1891 and 1984, killed by federal law and modern economics and the slow death of cultures that couldn't adapt to changing times. Raymond Harlow's story has no heroes, no satisfying conclusion where justice triumphs and lessons are learned. It has a father who valued legacy more than 11 human lives, and it has a thief who stole knowledge without understanding the codes that governed mountain justice. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned Appalachia, a legal framework that couldn't protect illegal enterprises, even when those enterprises represented survival, and a culture so rooted in honor that asking for legal help seemed like accepting defeat. Was Raymond Harlow a mass murderer? Yes, unquestionably. He eliminated 11 people with premeditation, planning, and no legal justification. He transformed his sons into killers, destroyed their lives, along with his own. He chose violence when other options existed, when acceptance or patience could have avoided massacre. Was he also a desperate father, driven beyond limits by theft and economic collapse? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. It forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid about desperation, honor, and the price of survival in a world that stopped valuing mountain people sometime in the 20th century and never looked back. Raymond Harlow crossed a boundary no human should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where moonshiners had no legal recourse, where theft of recipes went unpunished, because victims couldn't admit to crimes in court, where honor and legacy mattered more than law, because they were all men like the Harlows, possessed. There's no easy answer here, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion. Just blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides of a conflict that could have been resolved with basic fairness and human decency. 41 years later, the recipe is gone, the bodies are still dead, and nobody can agree whether Raymond Harlow was a murderer defending his family or a monster who dressed up slaughter as justice. The mountains keep their secrets, offering no answers to questions that have no right answers to give. The Harlow legacy died in concrete cages and blood-soaked ground, a dynasty drowned by decisions made on one September night when a father decided that copper stills and corn mash recipes mattered more than mercy, more than law, more than the lives of 11 men who died, never understanding why mountain justice demanded their blood as payment for knowledge they didn't steal and codes they never knew existed.